Hello, everyone, and welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is in conjunction with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we read through and study all of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. So you can follow along via the Bible study or just the podcast. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Today, I'm going to set the scene for the remaining 3 books of the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible. We've looked at Genesis, we've looked at Exodus, and now I'm sort of quickly going through the remaining 3. The reason why I'm not spending as much time on these 3 books is because a lot of what they cover, we've already covered from Genesis and Exodus. There's a lot of repeated material. We pick it up in other places. So I don't want to belabor the process, and I want to give more time to some of the other books that are going to provide us with new information and move the narrative forward. So we're just going to quickly cover Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you're in the Bible study, I've assigned just snippets of readings from each of those books to hit the high points, kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about, and then I will cover what I think you need to know to have a background for our continued study of Scripture. So let's set the scene for the rest of the Pentateuch. If you're able to see this presentation online, I have a map here, a timeline of the events of the Bible, of the Old Testament particularly. If you are listening, you can Google such a timeline for yourself. But where we are at is at the foot of Mount Sinai. That's where they encamped after they came out of the Red Sea. Remember, the Israelites journeyed through the desert. God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai, and there formed him into this nation Israel, his people. And they stay there for a while. So all of Leviticus takes place still at the foot of Mount Sinai, and actually the first 10 chapters of Numbers as well. It's just more of the law, of organizing themselves, of God explaining all the systems and processes and the ways for them to remain holy. So they stay there for about a year. And then they head into the desert, which we're going to cover from Numbers 10 on. And if you know the story, you know that because of their unfaithfulness, because of some of the things that they do, God punishes them by saying, you're going to now wander in the desert for 40 years. We'll talk about that when we look at Numbers. So we haven't moved much forward in time from where we've been. There'll be a little bit of geographical movement just to kind of take us from that foot of Mount Sinai to just before they're going to cross the River Jordan into the land of Canaan. So the rough timeline of the events of the Pentateuch, if we go all the way back to where we started, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are what we might call prehistory. It's not datable, it's events, creation and the flood and ancient events and stories and narrative that they cannot associate a specific time to. And then in Genesis 12, we begin the history of the patriarchs, who are the group of men who paved the way for the birth of the nation of Israel. And that is datable history, and that covers several hundred years. We look at a few generations of Abraham's family. Then we get to Exodus, and the first 3 chapters of Exodus alone cover a time span of hundreds of years. We see them at the end of Genesis. They're in a good place. They're in Egypt because of the famine, but they're well provided for. By the start of Exodus, generations have gone by. They're now enslaved by Pharaoh, and he's actually trying to murder their children. Then from Exodus 4 to Numbers 10, that whole event, starting from God calling Moses to lead his people, all the way to when they're going to leave the foot of Mount Sinai, that's about a year. So, several months worth of plagues, a couple months worth of journeying through the desert to get to Mount Sinai, and then a couple months at Mount Sinai to get the laws and have all the stuff that happened with the golden calf and figure out how to build the tabernacle. All of that's happening. So a lot going on in a 1-year period. Then we're going to go into the wilderness again in Numbers 10, as I said, through Numbers 36, and that's about 40 years of journeying and wandering because of their unfaithfulness. And then Deuteronomy is really outside of time. If we had to give it a time frame, we would say it's about a day. It's kind of a compilation of Moses' best sermons, his final words to the people, and the narrative will move forward a little bit in Deuteronomy because we will read about the death of Moses. So picking up where we left off, at the conclusion of Exodus, if we remember, the people had rededicated themselves after all the bad things that happened with the golden calf. They renewed the Mosaic covenant. They have affirmed that they're going to be God's people. They completed their preparations for the priesthood and anointed and ordained the priests. They created the tabernacle and built it according to God's plans. And then once more, that triumphant moment when God dwells amongst them again. Yes, in the tabernacle. So we're not back to where we were in the Garden of Eden, but much better than where we've been at any point since then. God is dwelling amongst his people with a lot of precautions in place. So naturally, we might think that the next chapter would take us on from Mount Sinai. We've seen the law. We've, gone through the events that happened at Sinai. But we're actually going to stand still with the book of Leviticus. We're missing some key information, and Leviticus fills in the gaps for us. Here again is also where we have evidence of editorial processes, multiple different accounts. Leviticus was probably a standalone manual or worship guide to how does the sacrificial system work? When do we celebrate certain feasts and festivals? How do we make sure that the priesthood is up to snuff and doing what they're supposed to be doing? What is that law again? So it's a record for the people. And so a lot of it covers old ground, and some of it is some new information. Numbers, as I said, does advance the chronological narrative. And then Deuteronomy, we stand still again for a recap of everything we've learned from Moses leading God's people. So let's talk about Leviticus. This book is at the heart of the Pentateuch. It is the middle book of the 5. It, as all of the Pentateuch was, is authored by Moses. He is the primary source of a lot of the material, but others have come along and edited and added in their own versions of stories as well. So it was all finally put into the written form that we have now sometime during the reign of the kings. So we haven't gotten to that part of history yet. The genres, we're going to find a lot of legal code, instructional material, covenant terms, pretty dry reading, a little bit of narrative, but not very much. Here, God had formed Israel into his people, but as we know, the question is, how do you maintain that relationship? Remember, the world of the ancient Near East is so very different from the one that God desired for his people and for all of us, for all of creation. And so how do you maintain that holiness? How do you keep that separateness? How do you stay faithful to God when all around you is temptation to go another way? A hint, the key word holy appears approximately 90 times in Leviticus. It depends on which translation you're looking at. That is more than any other book in the Bible. So that word holy is going to be the key for how these people can continue to have a relationship, how they can maintain God living in their midst, how they will be able to follow all of these rules that God has given to them. So the structure, the first 17 chapters deal with the way to access God. So how to approach God. We're going to look at the sacrificial system and all the different types of offerings that could be given. Who is the representative of the system? The priests. And so what role do they play in the sacrifices and offerings? And then some restatement of some of the laws that we've already seen, and then some new additions, because here we're going to talk about cleansing physically and spiritually, what it means to be clean and what it means to be unclean, because that's important in accessing God. Then the next segment deals with the way to walk with God. So now we have laws that look at practical guidelines for living in community, specifically a community of God's people. We get information about the different feasts and festivals, which provide boundaries for the way to use time and how to order one's time as a community of God's people. And then we get consequences and promises. So these are reminders of the covenant and the God whom Israel would serve, ending with that final note, like, remember who you belong to, remember the covenant you've made with me, remember the terms of that covenant, and stand strong. So, function of and themes in Leviticus. It functioned as, I've said, an instruction manual. So the people would use it, the priesthood system would use it. This is how they could hold one another accountable. Right now, the generation of Moses, the people that emerged from Egypt with Moses, they are hearing all these rules. They're there firsthand as God's forming them into a nation. But as the generations go, they're going to need to replicate this and be able to pass these laws and covenant terms down to the next generation. And so this becomes a way to do that. So in the future, 5 generations from now, people might be able to look at the priesthood system and say, hey, you know what? They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing because this is what we know from Leviticus. They should be operating in this fashion and they're not doing so. So this allowed each generation to know the ways in which God is calling them to be set apart. And we'll actually see this in the stories of the kings, because just a little bit of a spoiler alert, Israel is not going to be faithful. They are going to forget the covenant that they've made in the future generations, and the book of law will be discovered again, and there will actually be covenant renewal because they find this book and they go, oh my goodness, we're not doing any of the things that we were supposed to be doing. So it's an important book for the people. Themes that come from Leviticus: holiness and cleanliness, definitely. I told you the word holy 90 times, give or take, depending on which version you read. Cleanliness is another big theme. It's part of what it means to be holy. We see observance of God-ordained boundaries and procedures. So God is clearly delineating some lines to stay in. There's movement within those lines, but there's some clear things that God's going to say, this is okay and this is not okay. And I'm God and I get to make these rules. And you, by agreeing to the covenant, Old Testament Israelites, are saying that you will follow these rules. And then finally, I like to say it's a theme of girding your loins, if you will, just getting ready, preparing and strengthening themselves for the missional task that God has given them. Don't forget that God is not just calling Israel for the sake of Israel. He's doing this with a purpose in mind. Israel, he's setting them apart. He's calling them his people. He's rendering them holy. He's living amongst them so that they may be emboldened and encouraged and sustained to go forth and make God known to the rest of the world. Remember, God loves to use us. He likes to use human beings. He doesn't need us, but he enjoys using us to help further his plan of redemption. And that's a blessing for us as human beings. We get to join in with the work of God, and that's what God is wanting here in the Old Testament. All right, so quick intro to Numbers. I'm doing all 3 books because then my class will be reading through segments and there'll be a lecture after each section about the book in question. So looking at Numbers, again, written by Moses with editorial insertions put into final written form sometime during the time of Kings. The genres will find a lot more narrative in Numbers. The story's finally going to move forward. And as the name Numbers suggest, we're going to have some lists and censuses. How do you say that? Plural. Censi. Anyway, there's some census data as well in Numbers. There's geographical movement. The locations of the people are important. The names are important. Some of the names are named after what happens in that location in the wilderness. So we start at Sinai with preparations for departure. Then they journey into the wilderness and they go to several places, but one big point in their journey is in Kadesh. This is when the spies go out on their mission and come back with a report, and it has disastrous ramifications for basically all of Israel. And then the next big location, again, between Kadesh and Moab, they do go to some other places, but they sort of camp again for a longer period at Moab. And this is where we see preparations for entrance into the land of Canaan. We get the story of the talking donkey and Balaam and Balak. We get the apostasy at Peor and the plagues that result. And Joshua is named as Moses' successor. And then finally, the Israelites would leave and begin what turns out to be a long journey to the land of promise. So should have taken, a few months, ends up taking 40 years. And again, if you're able to view this presentation, I have a map here. You can also Google this to see the circuitous journey that they take. They do not go in a straight line. They wander, they double back on themselves because of their own lack of faith. So this just shows you a little bit, best guess of what that would have looked like. And then I have another diagram. There's multiple that you can pull up that shows where some of the big events happen. So for instance, the incident of getting water from the rock, where they were when the golden calf was worshipped, that kind of thing. These are all suggestions. Some of these locations are probably a little easier to prove than others, and some of them are still uncertain. Like, for instance, scholars aren't 100% certain of where Mount Sinai actually is. They have a good idea, but it's not 100%. So anyway, take some time and Google those, and you can see the long, arduous journey these people had to take. So the structure of Numbers, kind of divided into three overarching segments. The first chapters are about preparation, a lot of census numbers in here, organization of the people. This is at Mount Sinai, as I said. Then we have chapters 10 through 25, which are really wandering chapters, and a lot of tough things happening for Israel. They have a lot of rebellion. There's a lot of complaining, a lot of testing going on in the wilderness. And then the final 10 chapters or so are kind of like a take two. They reorganize themselves. They take another census because God calls them to go into battle. And just some odds and ends, settling up the land, who's going to get what when they do get into the promised land, and final preparations for what that's going to look like. And that is at the plains of Moab. Themes and Numbers: faith and trust, or lack thereof. Moses' leadership development. So when the narrative picks up again, let's look carefully at what happens to Moses. How does he develop as a leader? Is he getting stronger? There's going to be an incident that does not shed good light on him and causes him to receive punishment as well. We're going to continue to see God use ordinary people and things, even a donkey, to accomplish his purposes. So we want to pay attention to that, and we'll talk about what that might mean for us. Life in a nomadic community. As you're reading or thinking about this period of biblical history, imagine what it was like to be on this journey. This is real life. People are having children and taking care of toddlers. There's teenagers rebelling. There's parents that are older that needed to be cared for. There were sick people. People would have died along the way. The difficulty of finding food and water, and the trust issues they have with, is God going to continue to provide that? All of these things, this is real life. The setting up and taking down of the tents. There's a lot going on that I wish there was more detail on just the real stuff of life, because that's what's so interesting to me. But we have to kind of put ourselves in the dusty sandals of the Israelites and cut them a little slack, because it would have been really hard, a huge test of faith to make that journey. And on top of it, to be surrounded by threats and just such a different way of life, to have come from such a different way of life and just beginning to know God and all the things that God wants from you. This is not an easy time in their life. So now let's talk a little bit about Deuteronomy. Again, written by Moses. Mostly this is a compilation of Moses' best sermons. It's a recap of everything that has transpired in his time. So if you ever want to kind of revisit this period of the Bible again, you could just read Deuteronomy and you would get the highlights, the main things that you would want to pull out of both Exodus, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It's also a look ahead. There's a point where Moses has some prophecy. He's reminding the people of the terms of the covenant and kind of what God's going to require as they move forward into the promised land. And the big theme is remember what the Lord has done and be prepared for what the Lord is going to do. So the structure, the first 4 chapters or so are kind of a review of the past and all of the events that have led the people to this point where they're poised to enter into Canaan. Then the next large section, most of the book, deals with stipulations of the covenant. So it's going to restate some of the laws that we've already seen, restate terms, a lot of material we've covered already. Then chapters 27 through 29 are going to look at blessings and curses. We've seen this in other places. I just haven't talked about it yet. So here's where I'm going to dive in when we get to Deuteronomy and kind of look at what does it mean to obey the covenant? What are those blessings? And if you disobey, what are the curses? And then there's covenant renewal. This is a huge thing in the Old Testament. They renew the covenant many, many times, and we'll see it here in Deuteronomy. And then the final chapters are looking to the future. It's the end of Moses' story. Deuteronomy is going to end with his death. Much of the information, as I said, about the law is repeated from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but we do find some new material. There's some more details given about the law and definitely an elaborated pronouncement of blessings and curses with elements of prophecy in that. So themes we'll see in Deuteronomy, remember, exclamation points, remember what God has done. This is huge. This is something that we can apply to our own lives thousands of years later. Remember what has happened. Remember where you came from. It's easy to forget. We get caught up in the moment and in our surroundings, or we look too far ahead and get discouraged or fearful of what's to come. And sometimes we forget to think, oh my goodness, like how far I've come from where I started. And here's where God has shown up in my story. And so this is that on a nationwide scale for Israel. Faith and trust. What does it mean to have those? God is not asking them to have completely blind faith and trust. Yes, it still requires a leap. Faith always does. We don't get to know everything about God. We don't get to see God face to face. So there's always an element of faith and trust involved, but it's an informed faith and trust. God has revealed so much about himself already and so much about himself through this history, through what has happened just in Moses' lifetime as he's led the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness into this place where God is making them into a nation. And then obedience equals blessing, and disobedience equals the removal of the covenant blessing. This is going to be important theology that they're going to kind of take out of context and misapply in their faith life. So we're going to look at that. But we definitely want to look at these covenant terms and what does that mean? What are the blessings? What are the removal of blessings, if you will? All right, that should set you up for your reading this week. Again, if you're in my study, we'll be reading some parts of Leviticus. Probably the most significant amount of material will be Numbers because that does advance the narrative, and I want you to follow along with them as they continue to make their journey. And then a little bit, not too much from Deuteronomy, just a little bit. But like I said, if someday you want to go back and review this material, you could just read Deuteronomy and get so much out of that. So just file that away for the future. All right, I hope you have a great week, and I hope you enjoy your reading this week.